a day I suspect will be burned in many of our memories, as Europe is at war, and oil prices are reflecting that this morning. That particular infographic that's up on the screen right now was drafted a few hours ago, well, actually was drafted a few days ago to be published, but published a few hours ago, and is already out of date, with oil prices well above $100 now and holding. So that will not be my question, because it was dropped below 100 when it first happened. But nonetheless, the seriousness of the situation is dawning on all markets. And I'm going to kick off this morning with Mark Ostwald. Excuse me, Carol, I know that is normally your posture, but I wanted to get Mark Ostwald's comments in early this morning, Chief Economist and Global Strategist at ADM Investor Services International. Because Mark, of course, you're very close to Poland. It is a place where you have a home, and it's also a region that you cover professionally. I wanted to get your assessment this morning on what all this looks like. How deep a crevice have we just moved into, do you think?
Well, we've got to a crisis point which has been brewing probably for the best part of 25 years. The push to move NATO east has been there for a very long time, and it's interesting when one considers that the architect of the Cold War in the United States warned precisely against doing this back 25 years ago. That doesn't make anything about what Mr. Putin is doing right, but it is basically something which has been brewing for a long time, and it's a very sad day for Europe. It's not that long ago that the Yugoslav civil war ended, and again we are faced with war in Europe. I think the situation now, I think the most important thing, and this is what's not been going on really, is there is a united front presented by the EU and the United States in the face of this aggression. And that's absolutely critical, because part of what Putin's doing, in my assessment, is basically prodding at the disunity, and also effectively not taking revenge, but basically protesting against that push east, and it hangs on all of this. The other critical point here is, how is China going to react in all of this? And I can't imagine that the closer relationship that Russia and China has built over the last 10 years is actually going to be improved by this situation. It'll be very interesting to see how they react to all of it, but it leaves financial markets who have been very complacent about this. I think I heard too much of people saying, oh, well, this is just like Crimea. Well, it doesn't look that way to me.
Dr. Carol Nackley, CEO of Crystal Energy. Carol, connect the dots for us. Obviously, this is a very significant military event and war in Europe. Where do the dominoes fall from here vis-a-vis the dot connection? We're coming out of winter, more or less, in Europe, March around the corner, the Fed about to pull the trigger on interest rates. How do all of these things now stack up? Is it a different world, a different consideration this morning?
Good morning, Sean. Good morning, everyone. Well, look, the situation is still unfolding. We all woke up, I would say, surprised, even though we have been warned about it now for weeks. So we were supposed to be psychologically prepared, but you're never really psychologically prepared for something like that when it happens suddenly. So it's still unfolding. Just, a quick look at the markets, which are still not open fully, at least in Asia. You see some panic reaction. Oil, as you said, it exceeded $100 Brent. And we will have to wait and see how the things are going to unfold, because you have to distinguish between the military side, how the West will respond in terms of sanctions. I doubt there will be any military involvement from the West in Ukraine. They have made that at least clear so far. Whether that will change, you have to wait and see. But there is a big question of sanctions. So far, the reaction has been mild from the Western authorities, at least from Europe, because they would like to keep some kind of room for negotiations with Putin. And then they are leaving perhaps tougher sanctions for when the situation really worsens and gets into a critical stage. So far, the sanctions that have been made more or less public, or albeit not really quite official, don't target energy supplies. However, the big question is, how Putin is going to retaliate. So is he going to cut off supplies, both oil and gas supplies? They are the largest exporter of natural gas, second largest exporter of crude oil. That will create mayhem in markets, at least in the short term, in terms of panic. People are going to build inventories, and as a result, we're going to see further upward pressure on prices. But then what will happen after that? That is a question, again, to be seen, the impact on the economies, because we talk about energy markets, but we forget that both Russia and even more so Ukraine are important exporters of grains, such as corn and wheat, and also metals and products, inputs needed to produce chips, such as neon and palladium, for example. So how will that filter into the impact on global trade, on global economies, will remain to be seen. But at the moment right now, I wish I can connect all the dots for you, Sean, but we're still waking up to this shock, I would say, at least here in Europe.
Sarah Akbar, Chairperson and CEO of OilServe Kuwait and non-executive director of Petrofac. Sarah, what does this mean for the Gulf? I mean, Mark mentioned there that Europe needs to stand united, US-Europe axis, the Western axis. But surely this is a responsibility of the whole world. The Middle East now can no longer really stand on the sidelines of this one, or can they? Gulf oil producers going into an OPEC meeting, OPEC plus meeting next week with Russia. Will they have to take a position on this, do you think?
Well, good morning, Sean. So I think, the implications of this is even bigger than the Middle East. I mean, think of this, if the world stands and does nothing about this, China will take Taiwan tomorrow. What will stop them? So it will add to more disability, instability on a world level. So that's why the whole world have to react to this aggression and try to mitigate and stop it somehow. And I think that the kind of diplomacy that the Middle East at this point in time plays should have a role into trying to bring some sense into this, to Russia. So I think there will be side discussions on this. And don't forget, the immediate reaction to this aggression was the oil prices jumped to 100. And probably if there are any kind of sanctions on Russia, it will be even much more, and the world will be even in a bigger trouble. So many elements to balance in this picture. And I believe that, Saudi and the other members of OPEC will have to do some kind of trying to convince Russia to stop at a certain, at a certain point and not continue. And, basically they will do two things. One, they will step up production so that they can compensate for any losses and maybe, ease off the energy market. So they do need to step up and try to produce more, but in the same time, they do have to utilize this special relationship that they have with Russia in order to bring some logic and, some kind of logic into Russia. All what we need is some logical intervention here.
Mark, unlike 30 years ago when Iraq invaded Kuwait and a big army moved into the desert to repel it, we had only this week, as I mentioned earlier during the week, Iraq pay its last reparations to Kuwait only on Monday, 30 odd years later. But I'm looking at Russia, Mark, from the point of view of looking behind the Iron Curtain, as it was once called. Is there any vulnerability to the system in Russia, to Putin from inside, given the scale of the act that he's taken here, putting Russia at least against much of the world? But is there any vulnerability, just to sort of address that point? Of course, he's got foes externally. Has he lock, stock and barrel got Russia under his total grip?
I think the signs in Russia have been for quite some time that there is more dissidence, but he's been ruling it with iron fist. I think the critical point, which has been going on in my mind throughout this, is how much of the mismanagement of the economy during the COVID, the whole COVID period, is that a factor in his taking aggression? Is he trying to show he's strong simply because the management of the whole COVID situation was extraordinarily poor in Russia. Even their take up of their own vaccine, there's I think something like 35-40%. So is this partly also, on top of all the other geostrategic reasons, an attempt to basically show he's strong, because that in the past has appealed to the local population? And it certainly, I think that plays a role in there. I don't at the moment think that there's anything from the dissident branch which would undermine him. But I do have some questions about whether there are maybe factions within the ruling party in Russia who start to wonder whether he has really taken this too far, and that all the power that they've given him was perhaps a mistake. But we shall have to see how that pans out. For the time being, I don't think we're really going to see anyone trying to stick a knife in Putin's back in the proverbial sense.
Carol, again, dot connecting, I'll put it out there. We have the Iran nuclear talks only down the street from the crevice that is Ukraine. It's interesting when you look at the map of Ukraine, it borders so many countries on the west, not quite Austria, but not far away, Hungary. Nonetheless, Vienna Iranian talks are at a very advanced stage, it would appear, by all of the messaging coming out of Vienna. How does this impact, do you think, or is it a totally separate corridor?
No, it's not a separate corridor entirely. Actually, the timing is interesting that the deal is almost reaching an end, as the media has been reporting. But when it comes to the influence of Iran on markets, we have to distinguish between two things. There are certain barrels that will come straight away, and these have been stored in ships. However, there are some of, I would say, even a large proportion, I don't have the exact figure, but those barrels that people are telling us that are stored in ships, they are already trading in the markets. They have been exported. It's very easy to change the name of the ship, or it's the ownership of the ship, and send the barrels to the market. So we shouldn't expect miracles immediately coming out of the deal if it is reached in terms of oil market, though it can dampen a little bit the kind of anxiousness in the market. I would say at best it could dampen increase the climb in prices. But the big thing that can happen, and that will take perhaps a couple of months to materialize, is if Iran scale up production and restores production to pre-sanctions level. But immediately, even if the deal is signed, we should not expect miracles. It all depends, again, Sean, at the moment, we are all speculating, because even the market sentiment, the fear is about speculation of potential supply disruption. So far, we haven't seen supply disruptions. Russia did not cut the supplies. It may retaliate. It did not do that after the annexation of Crimea and the imposition of sanctions. They did not retaliate. Whether Putin would go to activate the nuclear option, we're going to see. Yes, economically, they can sustain, the Russians can sustain sanctions and cut off of supplies for a while. But if they go into a fully fledged war, then it's going to be costly for them. And the Americans and Western powers, if they want to do something today, is to make it as costly as possible to President Putin from this invasion of Ukraine.
Sarah, I know we're sort of tackling some questions here this morning that isn't in our perfect wheelhouse of expertise, but nonetheless, certain moments compel us to think beyond that. And one of them for you, as you addressed earlier in your earlier point, is the China move on Taiwan, perhaps, and so forth. The question I have for you is, how long, or is this a moment where the Gulf and the Middle East, but let's say the Gulf because that's where we are, have to step away from what appears to be a somewhat of a double standard? They're happy to embrace China and Russia, who have an ongoing relationship with all sorts of fellows, particularly Iran, but yet America and the West is not allowed to have a relationship with Iran. And when they make gestures like the JCPOA, they get a lot of harassment from that. I'm wondering your position, your views on that line being maintained at a moment like this, when clearly there's cracks emerging in the geopolitical picture.
Well, I think we have no other option, Sean, but to play this balance act between Russia, China, and the US. Now, the harassment you are talking about was a result of that the original GPS, the original agreement that was signed was signed in complete absence of the whole region. We were not involved in any of the discussions. We really didn't know what were they discussing, and we had no presence whatsoever. So that's why when the second opportunity came about, we said, okay, listen to us. We are the people who are facing this directly. So why we are not being listened to, why we don't have a seat on the table. And this is why there was, but in reality, we are not of that, and the GCC have never been that party that harasses anyone. We are—
well, harass perhaps is the wrong word, but facilitates the idea that Russia and China can have relationships with everybody, but the West cannot.
Well, you see, this political role on an international scene is really recent for the region. We have not been a major player on those type of discussions. We've never been. So this is a new role. And I think so far in multiple fronts, the region have been doing extremely well in bringing people together and trying to work out solutions. But are we going to be effective in driving, this international agenda of peace? And this process, I think they will try their best, but it's all in the hands of the Europeans and the Americans, really. So,
Mark, speaking beyond into the East, Asia, and the impact, just sort of looking at this as pure crass economics, $100 oil again, forever long it will be with us. It's a substantial number. The emerging economies, India, were crying at $60, quiet at 100 or 90. I'm wondering, what are the domino impacts here on demand erosion or elasticity in Asia, do you think?
Well, I think it comes at an interesting point because we've, even in Asia, leaving aside China, most countries are removing restrictions and demand was just about to start going up. So I wonder how much that is going to impact that, simply because we've already got inflation of all types: food, energy, housing. So $100 oil is just going to hit consumers in the pocket. I think the biggest concern here is not only in Asia, and Asia is critical in all of this because it is the engine of world growth nowadays. So, this increase in oil prices is going to hit Asia pretty hard, and it's going to hit the whole of the world hard. But it's going to do, I think it puts a big spoke in the wheel of the recovery as we go into an endemic rather than a pandemic stage. And it really, it's how long people actually can absorb this, because we've had so much supply chain pressure, and to add this on top of all of that really does leave a lot of questions, and particularly as we're in a situation where central banks have been thinking about trying to fend that off. But is this the moment to be doing that, even if it's instinctively going to make the inflation situation that much worse?
Carol, you could pick up on that point, but also I'd like you to address the fact that OPEC Plus is meeting in a matter of days. I know you said earlier this is early doors on this crisis to really read all the tea leaves on it, but ultimately, should we expect any change? Would you advise any change than just a roll over 15-minute meeting and get out of the way as quickly as possible?
Yeah, first let me comment, just to add to what Mark said on how the energy prices are going to impact economies. Well, look, I don't think they're going to cause massive disruptions and I'll come back to that point, so don't hold it against me. In terms of oil price impact on economies, we see that has weakened over the years, but it's going to impact through inflationary pressure, because we see that the major economies, including in Asia, like China, here in Europe, in the US, inflation is hitting levels we have not seen for decades, and a big chunk of that inflationary pressure is coming from higher energy prices. So this is the way I see the immediate link, if you want, between the crisis, especially if it results in disruptions in supplies. If the high prices are sustained for a much longer period, then an immediate panic reaction, then we go to see increasing pressure on prices, further fueling inflation, and that can actually force central banks to act even faster than what they thought they were going to do earlier. Now, going back to OPEC, all along OPEC and OPEC Plus, but OPEC in particular, they have been loyal to their core objective, that is maintaining market stability. So if the market stability is under attack, as we see today, for example, we have great market volatility. After all, yes, high prices are good for producers up to a point, not if they translate into a greater disruption to, or potentially structural destruction of demand, or even more so encouraging supplies from outside the organization. Then they have to act and then take some steps. And if they believe the situation is going to escalate further, then I wouldn't rule out entirely the Saudis putting more oil barrels in the market. We saw they did that. I mean, they are not always in bed with the Russians in terms of agreement on what to do with the market. We saw this agreement in March 2020. So if they think that this is going to really threaten the stability that they are so loyal to in oil markets, then I would see them putting extra barrels in the market. Maybe not OPEC as a whole, because you have members struggling, but definitely the big players, particularly Saudi Arabia.
Sarah, on that point, just sort of taking it a little bit further down the time corridor, is clearly at these prices, this is an incentive to invest more in new capacity. I'm wondering if you're seeing that already, this going forward. Obviously, we've got UAE have publicly announced a few times that they're targeting 5 million and so on. Your thoughts on where the Gulf is in adding that new capacity in this current window of time? Obviously not today or tomorrow, but you're on mute, Sarah. Sorry.
Yeah. So the first thing I want to say is, the reason behind OPEC Plus is gone. So they were managing the market because they had surplus, because they were trying to create stability by managing supply. But that really is gone now, because the price is high. It's more than where they wished for. There isn't much, supply, storage and availability in any of the countries to be able to manage the market going further. So the rationale behind OPEC Plus probably is much weaker at this point in time. I wonder if it will continue as OPEC Plus, or they will go back to just being OPEC and to normal business. But the second point is their drive to invest more into the industry. Definitely each single country now is gearing up to invest, because they see this as probably the last cycle of high prices where they can monetize some of the assets that they have. So you will see frenzy of activity in every single GCC, Iraq, Iran probably as well, in trying to develop the resource as quickly as they can. But as you know, there is certain limitation on capacity. And think about it, at this point in time, to build any new facility, it will cost you a lot more, simply because of supply chain, inflation. Think about all the other factors that are going to come into play, availability of subcontractors that can do all these jobs that are lined up in each of these countries. So yes, there will be frenzy of activity. Are they going to achieve the production targets on the timing that can serve this current environment? Typically, it takes 3 to 5 years before you can add serious production in any of these countries. So yes, I definitely see a lot of projects.
But you could, for example, rehabilitate the neutral zone in Kuwait quite quickly.
Well, it is rehabilitated. It is in production now. They added the.
But 150, maybe you could get up to 450.
Yeah, there is potential there. Probably it will take around 2 years to add that potential. So it's not that easy. Most of these oil fields, especially the brown fields, they will take more activity in order to get them the type of production. There is some small pockets, but can it satisfy the world demand? I really doubt it.
Let's get the survey question before we go around the table to get everybody's crystal ball forecast for the weekend, because this is the end of our Middle East week on the show. It's a long way to Sunday, but nonetheless, we'll get people's views on where they think it's going. But the question we have today is, what is the likelihood of Russian energy exports to the West ending up being disrupted by war or sanctions or both? There's been a lot of political efforts to keep this off the table. Germany, Italy aggressively putting it, keeping it away from the American idea. But we've seen Nord Stream 2 already get quite a heavy slap down by the West. So my question is, what is the likelihood of Russian energy exports to the West ending up being disrupted by war or sanctions or both? Unlikely, likely, very likely, definitely. Tough question, I know, but nonetheless, crystal ball, this is evolving. Mark, your thoughts wrapping up obviously this is Thursday, still early morning in Europe, still a long way to the end of the business week. Your thoughts on where this may go as European capitals wake up? Do we see a much more aggressive sanctions even already, because it only started 2 days ago, a day or two ago, with fairly mild sanctions?
Well, I'm thinking more in terms of what imagination do they have for effective sanctions, and unfortunately, it all ends up in exactly the same place of what we were talking about. It's basically exports. How do we impact Russian exports of raw materials, be that metals, be that energy, be that agriculture? Because otherwise, anything else really isn't going to have much of an impact. And this is a very tough decision for Europe, and perhaps less so for the United States, being more self-sufficient, because if they do that, then there's going to be a very high economic cost, both in inflation terms, and they're basically struggling with the aftermath of COVID. So that is really the choice that Europe faces, and whether they, I don't think there's going to be a united front on that, but they would be best off, above all, not having arguments about this in public.
Dr. Carroll, your thoughts? The Jerome Powell is meant to be sitting in front of Congress today to give his sort of forecast of what he's meant to do next month on rates. There's been a growing sort of noise on the background, including from me, that it has to be a 50 basis point or else it's irrelevant. It's a bit like European sanctions at 25 basis points. Your thoughts? Is he up bright and early in Washington this morning adjusting his script, or same old? What are your thoughts on again, the dot connecting on all this?
No, I doubt he's going to rewrite his speech that he planned for today. I think it's too early to make any drastic decision to deviate from the policy that they have decided on. Maybe if things turn quite nasty in the coming months, they might revisit. But at the moment, they will continue, because at the end, the American economy is in much better shape, I would say, than what you have here in Europe, because they are shielded from what's happening. Even Europe itself, it's not a coherent entity, simply because the economies are not, they don't have the same exposure to what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. So we have more, the Western Europe is more shielded, including from any potential supplies cut off from Russia. Whereas, and it's not only energy supplies in that are relevant to Europe. For example, you look at Austria. Austria's banking sector is very well, connected to what's happening in the Russian economy. So again, with Europe, there is a greater divergence, and as Mark said, they have to showcase a united front. But I think Europe would like to maintain some kind of olive tree branch, whatever they call it, to maintain negotiations with Russia, because that's the only way they can avoid a more disastrous scenario that can affect the continent. But I doubt it's going to bring the economies to their knees. Not really a drastic scenario where all the economies are going to collapse. Some economies will suffer more than others, but it's mainly the geopolitical implications in the longer term. And just one last thing on the sanctions. If there are sanctions on Russia, they are likely to be more effective in the longer term production capacity of Russia, rather than in the short term.
Let's get the survey result and give Sarah the last word this morning. Likely and very unlikely, likely and very likely, and definitely are sort of gaining most of the views in this room. Sarah, do we get through the day today with the Middle East, the Gulf states remaining silent, saying nothing? We've had China already come out saying, oh, we should give Ukraine and Russia the chance to sort out their own problems.
Well, I think in the Middle East, they will have some kind of statement, but it will be more neutral and balanced. Like I said, they will not
like
take
Fox
sides.
News sounds like.
Yeah. So they will not take sides at this point in time. They will see the direction first. But going to the point of sanctions on Russia, on the energy sector, I wonder why would anyone shoot himself in the foot? That will be sanctions on Russia. So it's very, very illogical. I've seen
Which is ultimately the sort of ace card that Putin has. Any step against him is a kind of own goal.
Absolutely. So I don't see any point in putting any more sanctions on Russia and the effectiveness of any sanctions at this point in time. It's only harmful to the West themselves. It will create more instability, economic instability in Europe, because if they don't have access to gas, economically they'll be suffering. So what's the point of weakening themselves in a crisis?
Okay, we will wrap it up there. It seems to me the only decision to be made at this point is by President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people. They either get savagely butchered in remaining by putting up a line of defense, or they show the white flag and invite him into Kiev, because there's no cavalry coming over the hill to save the Ukrainians, and they are on their own, and they can either fight and be slaughtered, or they can take the inevitable, because the West has given up Ukraine and are willing to revert back to a sort of pre-Orange Revolution posture that the West existed with Ukraine 10 years ago. That's my sense of things. Wrapping up, Mark, thank you so much as always. Carol, thank you. Sarah, we have our IP Week Fujairah workshop this morning, which is actually in half an hour. You're all more than welcome to join us. I'm sure this narrative will dominate, although it was not the intention, but nonetheless, it is the 10,000 pound gorilla in the room today, and we will be probably touching on it there as well, but hopefully on many other things. So half an hour, please join us if you are available. All the best and have a great day.
Bye-bye.